The morning of April 12, 1944, began like any other day of desperate defense on Kanaloa Island. Japanese Infantry Lieutenant Akira Matsumoto crouched behind reinforced concrete barriers, confident that his elevated position 150 feet from the American landing zone provided absolute safety from enemy flamethrowers. His battalion had studied American tactics for months. Flame weapons were devastating, but only at close range, maybe 30 feet maximum. What happened next would leave Japanese defenders so stunned, so overwhelmed by a weapon's impossible reach, that many would later describe it as watching fire rain from the heavens themselves. But how did America extend the flamethrower's deadly range by 500%? And why did this technological breakthrough shatter Japan's most carefully planned defensive positions across the Pacific? Kanaloa Island was never supposed to fall quickly. This fortress of coral and volcanic rock in the Caroline Chain sat 800 miles southeast of Truk Lagoon like a sentinel guarding Japan's outer defensive perimeter. American intelligence estimated the island would take 10 days to capture. They were wrong by 5 weeks and 12,000 casualties. The island's name, derived from ancient Polynesian mythology meaning guardian of the deep, had proven prophetic. The landscape itself seemed designed by nature to repel invaders. Razor-sharp coral reefs surrounded the island like natural barriers, creating only 3 viable landing beaches. Dense mangrove swamps covered the interior lowlands, while steep limestone cliffs rose 800 feet above the coastline, creating perfect observation and firing positions. But it wasn't just geography that made Kanaloa nearly impregnable. It was what the Japanese had learned from their defeats across the Pacific, and the revolutionary defensive strategy they had developed in response. The island measured barely 12 square miles, but every inch had been transformed into an interconnected killing field. Unlike previous Pacific battles where Japanese forces had relied on beach defenses or underground tunnel systems, Kanaloa represented something entirely new: layered defensive zones calculated with mathematical precision to exploit the known limitations of American weapons. For 8 months before the American invasion, 25,000 Japanese soldiers under Lieutenant General Hideki Tanaka had transformed Kanaloa into the most sophisticated defensive network the Pacific War had ever seen. But this wasn't the random placement of bunkers and trenches that had characterized earlier defensive efforts. This was warfare reduced to pure mathematics. Japanese military engineers had conducted exhaustive studies of every American assault from Guadalcanal to the Marshall Islands. They had interviewed survivors, analyzed captured equipment, and most importantly, they had calculated the exact effective ranges of every weapon in the American arsenal. Their findings had led to a revolutionary conclusion: defensive positioning could be used as a weapon itself. Lieutenant Akira Matsumoto had been one of the primary architects of this new defensive philosophy. A former engineering student at Tokyo Imperial University, Matsumoto had applied his mathematical background to the problem of defensive warfare with scientific precision. His calculations were elegant in their simplicity. If American flamethrowers had a maximum effective range of 35 feet, then defensive positions placed at 150 feet would be completely immune to the most devastating weapon in the American inventory. The Japanese strategy went far beyond simple distance calculations. Matsumoto and his team had mapped every possible approach route to their positions, calculating exact firing angles, overlapping fields of fire, and optimal positioning for maximum defensive effectiveness. They had created what military historians would later describe as the first scientifically engineered defensive network in Pacific warfare. The main defensive line on Kanaloa consisted of 17 major strongpoints, each positioned exactly 150 feet from the most likely American advance routes. These weren't simple bunkers, but sophisticated concrete and steel fortifications designed to withstand direct hits from naval artillery while providing clear lines of sight to potential targets. Each position was connected to the others through a network of communication trenches that allowed defenders to coordinate their fire with precision timing. Matsumoto's unit controlled what they called Position 7, a commanding fortification overlooking Sunset Beach, the largest and most likely American landing site. From their observation post, they could see every grain of sand on the beach below while remaining safely beyond any American weapon except heavy artillery, and the position had been designed to survive even that. The mathematical elegance of the defensive plan extended to ammunition calculations, supply distribution, and even casualty estimates. Japanese planners had calculated that they could inflict a 4-to-1 casualty ratio on American forces while maintaining their positions indefinitely. The numbers seemed to guarantee victory through simple attrition. What made the Kanaloa defense truly revolutionary was its integration of multiple defensive concepts into a single, coherent system. Previous Japanese defensive efforts had relied primarily on the fighting spirit of individual soldiers. Kanaloa represented the application of modern engineering principles to the ancient art of fortification. The defensive zones were arranged in 3 concentric rings, each designed to serve a specific purpose in the overall defensive plan. The outer ring consisted of observation posts and early warning positions, designed not to stop American forces, but to track their movements and provide detailed intelligence to the main defensive positions. These outer positions were deliberately placed at distances that would appear to be within flamethrower range, but were actually positioned to draw American flame teams into carefully prepared killing zones. The middle ring contained the primary defensive strongpoints, including Matsumoto's Position 7. These fortifications were the mathematical heart of the defensive system, positioned at exactly 150 feet from all potential American advance routes. Each position had been surveyed and resurveyed to ensure perfect distance calculations. Japanese engineers had used captured American flamethrowers to test these distances repeatedly, confirming that their defensive positions were completely beyond the reach of enemy flame weapons. The inner ring served as the final defensive line, consisting of heavily fortified positions designed to be held even if the outer defenses were penetrated. But the mathematical calculations suggested that American forces would never reach these inner positions, having been decimated during their attempts to cross the 150-foot killing zones that surrounded the middle ring. Each defensive position had been supplied with enough ammunition, food, and water to sustain a siege lasting several months. Underground storage chambers connected to the main bunkers through coral tunnels that had been carved by hand over the course of 8 months. The Japanese had learned from their experience at other Pacific strongholds that defensive positions often fell not to enemy action, but to supply shortages. The psychological aspect of the defense was equally carefully planned. Japanese defenders had been trained to recognize the distinctive appearance of American flamethrower equipment and to target flame teams with concentrated fire the moment they appeared. The goal was not just to kill enemy flame operators, but to create such casualties among these specialist teams that American commanders would be reluctant to deploy them at all. Matsumoto himself had trained his men in the precise techniques needed to maximize the effectiveness of their defensive positions. They had practiced coordinated fire missions, target identification, and most importantly, the discipline needed to allow American forces to advance to exactly the right distance before opening fire. The mathematics of their defensive plan only worked if American forces were allowed to enter the killing zones before being engaged. The American invasion of Kanaloa began at 0630 hours on April 12, 1944, with the largest concentrated naval bombardment yet seen in the Pacific War. For 3 hours, battleships and cruisers pounded the island with high-explosive shells designed to destroy the Japanese defensive positions. From his position in the reinforced bunker of Position 7, Matsumoto could feel the entire island shaking under the impact of American naval gunfire. But the bombardment, massive as it was, had been anticipated in the Japanese defensive calculations. The concrete and steel bunkers had been designed specifically to withstand naval artillery, and most of the defensive positions survived the barrage with minimal damage. When the bombardment lifted and the first wave of American landing craft approached Sunset Beach, Matsumoto and his men were ready. The initial American assault followed exactly the pattern the Japanese planners had predicted. Marines landed on the beach in large numbers and quickly established a beachhead and began advancing inland toward the ridgelines where the main Japanese defensive positions waited. From his observation post, Matsumoto could see the American formation spreading out across the beach exactly as his calculations had predicted they would. The first test of the mathematical defense came when American infantry began their assault on the outer defensive ring. As planned, the Japanese observation posts offered only token resistance before withdrawing, allowing American forces to believe they were making significant progress. The real test would come when American forces encountered the middle ring of defensive positions, the carefully calculated killing zones where Japanese mathematics would meet American firepower. As American forces advanced up the coral slopes toward Position 7, Matsumoto could see that they were following the exact approach routes that had been predicted in the defensive planning. More importantly, he could see the distinctive equipment carried by American flamethrower teams, the bulky tanks and specialized weapons that represented the greatest threat to Japanese defensive positions. This fundamental misassessment of American capabilities and resolve would prove fatal to Japanese hopes of victory. The decoded intelligence revealed Japanese timeline with startling precision. The carrier striking force under Admiral Hayakawa would approach Coral Reef from the northwest on June 4, 1942. They planned to launch their initial attack at dawn, expecting to encounter minimal organized resistance from American forces they believed were thousands of miles away, undergoing repairs and reorganization. What they wouldn't expect was 3 fully operational American carrier task forces positioned northeast of Coral Reef in carefully chosen ambush positions, ready to catch the Japanese fleet at its most vulnerable moment during aircraft recovery operations. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Elizabeth Harper with carriers Enterprise and Wasp, would provide the primary striking power. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Catherine Bradley with the carrier Yorktown, would deliver coordinated follow-up attacks. Task Force 18, led by Rear Admiral Michelle Summers with the carrier Lexington, would serve as reserve force and provide additional flexibility. Together, these forces would deploy 147 aircraft against the Japanese formation's 284, but they possessed the decisive advantages of surprise, optimal positioning, and complete knowledge of enemy intentions, timing, and tactical planning. The contrast between American and Japanese intelligence operations couldn't have been more dramatic. While Japanese commanders dismissed intelligence and challenged their preconceptions, American officers embraced information that forced them to reconsider assumptions and adapt their strategies accordingly. The fundamental difference between American and Japanese command cultures extended far beyond mere organizational preferences. It represented completely different approaches to information processing, decision-making, and strategic adaptation that would ultimately determine the outcome of the Pacific War. Japanese naval culture, built upon centuries of tradition emphasizing honor, hierarchy, and absolute loyalty to superior officers, created an environment where questioning senior commanders' strategic assumptions was considered not merely insubordinate but fundamentally dishonorable. This cultural framework, which had served Japanese society effectively in many contexts, proved catastrophically unsuited to the demands of modern intelligence-based warfare. Admiral Hayakawa embodied both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of this system. Her tactical brilliance and inspirational leadership had generated 8 months of unprecedented naval victories. Her ability to coordinate complex multi-carrier operations had revolutionized Pacific warfare. Her strategic vision had brought Japan closer to total victory than any military leader in the nation's history. But success had transformed her from a tactically flexible commander into a strategically rigid leader who interpreted challenges to her assumptions as personal attacks on her competence and honor. The suggestion that American intelligence capabilities might exceed Japanese estimates wasn't merely wrong, it was insulting to contemplate. This psychological transformation affected the entire Japanese command structure. Squadron commanders who observed unusual American response patterns kept their concerns private rather than risk appearing to question superior officers' assessments. Pilots who reported increasingly sophisticated enemy tactics were told they were overestimating American capabilities. Intelligence officers who attempted to synthesize troubling indicators found their analyses dismissed as defeatist speculation. The Japanese had created what modern analysts would recognize as a classic confirmation bias feedback loop. Information that supported existing assumptions was welcomed and amplified. Intelligence that challenged prevailing wisdom was questioned, minimized, or ignored entirely. The result was a command structure that became progressively more disconnected from battlefield realities, even as those realities shifted decisively against Japanese interests. Commander Nakamura understood this dynamic better than most of her colleagues, having studied American naval culture during her pre-war intelligence training. She recognized that Japanese commanders were making strategic decisions based on outdated assumptions about American capabilities, resolve, and strategic planning. But the cultural and hierarchical barriers to effective communication of uncomfortable truths made it nearly impossible to correct these dangerous misconceptions. Meanwhile, American commanders operated within a fundamentally different cultural framework that actively encouraged subordinates to challenge assumptions, present contrary evidence, and engage in the kind of critical analysis that Japanese culture discouraged. This wasn't merely a matter of democratic versus authoritarian leadership styles. It represented completely different approaches to information processing and strategic adaptation.
British. By April 18th, American forces on Kanaloa were facing what military analysts would later describe as a perfect tactical stalemate. Japanese defensive positions were too strong to be taken by conventional assault, but too well positioned to be reached by the specialized weapons designed to break such fortifications. The mathematics of the situation seemed to guarantee endless stalemate, with American forces suffering continuous casualties while being unable to advance. American commanders tried increasingly desperate solutions. They requested massive increases in artillery support, hoping to simply pound Japanese positions into submission through sheer volume of fire. They called for experimental weapons, including rockets and specialized explosives that might be able to reach Japanese positions from extended ranges. They even considered bypassing Kanaloa entirely, though the island's strategic position made this tactically impossible. None of these solutions addressed the fundamental problem. American flamethrowers, the most effective weapons for clearing fortified positions, were being held out of range by defensive mathematics that seemed impossible to overcome. Japanese engineers had calculated the limitations of American weapons with scientific precision and had designed their defenses to exploit those limitations perfectly. From his position in the observation bunker of Position 7, Matsumoto could see the growing desperation of American tactics. Each day brought new attempts to solve the range equation, and each day those attempts failed against the mathematical certainty of Japanese defensive calculations. The 150-foot distance that separated American forces from Japanese positions had become an uncrossable gulf that protected the defenders as effectively as an ocean. The irony of the situation was not lost on either side. American forces possessed overwhelming superiority in numbers, equipment, naval support, and air power, but none of these advantages mattered against defensive positions that had been mathematically calculated to neutralize the one American weapon that could break fortified resistance. The Japanese had used American mathematical and engineering precision against American forces themselves. But in secret American workshops on the captured atoll of Majuro, 400 miles southeast of Kanaloa, Marine engineers were working around the clock on modifications to standard flamethrower equipment that would shatter every assumption Japanese defenders had made about flame warfare. These modifications were so radical, so contrary to accepted engineering principles, that they violated basic physics as military commanders understood them. The experimental weapons being developed at Majuro represented more than simple improvements to existing equipment. They represented a fundamental reimagining of how flame weapons could function, based on engineering principles that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in 1944. The modifications were so classified that even the Marine officers supervising the project weren't fully briefed on how the new weapons would function. What Japanese defenders like Lieutenant Matsumoto couldn't know was that their mathematically perfect defensive positions, designed to exploit the known limitations of conventional flame weapons, were about to become death traps when faced with American technology that could reach distances no one had thought possible. The supply ships carrying these experimental weapons were already approaching Kanaloa under cover of darkness, their cargo so secret that even the ship captains didn't know what they were transporting. The weapons had been tested only under laboratory conditions, and their first combat deployment would be against the defensive positions that had proven immune to conventional American tactics. The mathematical certainty that had protected Japanese defenders for 6 days was about to meet American engineering ingenuity that refused to accept the limitations of conventional physics. The 150-foot barrier that had seemed impossible to cross was about to be crossed in ways that would leave Japanese defenders questioning everything they thought they knew about warfare. The dragon's breath was about to reach farther than anyone had imagined possible, and the mathematical fortress of Kanaloa was about to discover that some equations could be rewritten by American engineers who refused to accept that any problem was unsolvable. Next episode: The Flame That Defied Physics. How American engineers created a weapon that could kill at impossible distances, and why Japanese defenders who witnessed it refused to believe what they were seeing. For 6 days, the mathematical fortress of Kanaloa Island had proven impregnable. Lieutenant Akira Matsumoto's precisely calculated defensive positions had shattered every American assault, keeping enemy flamethrowers safely beyond their 35-foot effective range while inflicting devastating casualties from 150 feet away. The Japanese mathematical defense seemed to guarantee eternal stalemate. But on the morning of April 19, 1944, everything changed. What Matsumoto witnessed that day would fundamentally alter his understanding of warfare, physics, and the limits of human ingenuity. The weapon that emerged from American experimental workshops would not just break his defensive calculations, it would rewrite the very rules of flame warfare in ways that seemed to violate the natural order itself.
British, 400 miles southeast of Kanaloa, on the captured atoll of Majuro, Marine Corps Engineer Captain Elena Rodriguez had spent 3 sleepless weeks performing what her colleagues called impossible modifications to standard M1A1 flamethrower equipment. Rodriguez, a former chemical engineering professor at Stanford University who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, approached the Kanaloa problem with the methodical precision of a scientist who refused to accept that any equation couldn't be solved. The problem that had been presented to Rodriguez's experimental team was elegant in its simplicity. Extend the effective range of portable flamethrowers from 35 feet to at least 150 feet without making the equipment too heavy for individual operators to carry. On paper, the request seemed to violate basic physics. The fuel mixture required to maintain combustion over such distances would need pressures that conventional equipment couldn't generate, and the weight penalties would make the weapons unusable in combat. Rodriguez's solution was revolutionary in its audacity. Instead of trying to force more fuel through existing nozzle designs, she completely redesigned the combustion system itself. Her modifications created what she called a staged ignition process, multiple ignition points along the fuel stream that maintained combustion far beyond the normal burnout distance of standard napalm mixtures. The technical breakthrough came from Rodriguez's background in industrial chemistry. She had worked on petroleum refining processes that used similar staged combustion principles to maintain controlled burns over extended distances. The challenge was adapting these industrial processes to portable military equipment that could function reliably under combat conditions. The modified flamethrowers, designated M1A1X in classified documents, featured 3 revolutionary improvements over standard equipment.
First, a new fuel mixture that Rodriguez called extended burn napalm, a jellied gasoline compound that included metallic additives designed to maintain combustion through multiple ignition stages. Second, a completely redesigned nozzle system that created controlled fuel dispersion patterns optimized for maximum range rather than maximum area coverage. Third, a modified pressure system that used compressed air chambers to maintain consistent fuel pressure throughout the extended firing sequence. The most radical innovation was Rodriguez's cascade ignition system. Instead of a single ignition point at the nozzle, the modified flamethrowers featured multiple ignition elements positioned along the fuel stream itself. As the extended burn napalm traveled through the air, these elements would reignite the fuel mixture at predetermined intervals, maintaining combustion over distances that conventional physics suggested should be impossible. Testing at Majuro had produced results that amazed even Rodriguez herself. The modified flamethrowers could maintain effective flame streams at distances approaching 175 feet, nearly 5 times the range of standard equipment. More importantly, the extended burn napalm maintained sufficient heat and adhesion properties at these extended ranges to be tactically useful against fortified positions. The psychological impact of the extended range flames was even more significant than their physical destructive power. Test observers reported that the sight of flame streams reaching far beyond normal expectations created an almost supernatural impression, as if the weapons had somehow transcended natural limitations through technological alchemy. But the most remarkable aspect of Rodriguez's modifications was their elegance. Despite the revolutionary improvements in range and effectiveness, the modified flamethrowers weighed only 15 pounds more than standard equipment and could be operated by any Marine trained on conventional flame weapons. The complexity of the engineering was hidden beneath a deceptively simple exterior that betrayed no hint of the technological breakthrough contained within. On the evening of April 18th, Rodriguez personally supervised the loading of 12 modified flamethrowers onto the transport vessel USS Antares for immediate deployment to Kanaloa. The weapons had undergone only minimal field testing, and their first combat use would be against the defensive positions that had proven immune to conventional American tactics. The deployment was conducted under conditions of absolute secrecy. Even the Marine officers who would operate the weapons weren't briefed on their extended capabilities until immediately before their first combat mission. The official designation remained M1A1, and the external appearance of the modified weapons was virtually identical to standard equipment. 400 miles southeast of Kanaloa, on the captured atoll of Majuro, Marine Corps Engineer Captain Elena Rodriguez had spent 3 sleepless weeks performing what her colleagues called impossible modifications to standard M1A1 flamethrower equipment. Rodriguez, a former chemical engineering professor at Stanford University who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, approached the Kanaloa problem with the methodical precision of a scientist who refused to accept that any equation couldn't be solved. The problem that had been presented to Rodriguez's experimental team was elegant in its simplicity. Extend the effective range of portable flamethrowers from 35 feet to at least 150 feet without making the equipment too heavy for individual operators to carry. On paper, the request seemed to violate basic physics. The fuel mixture required to maintain combustion over such distances would need pressures that conventional equipment couldn't generate, and the weight penalties would make the weapons unusable in combat. Rodriguez's solution was revolutionary in its audacity. Instead of trying to force more fuel through existing nozzle designs, she completely redesigned the combustion system itself. Her modifications created what she called a staged ignition process,
multiple ignition points along the fuel stream that maintained combustion far beyond the normal burnout distance of standard napalm mixtures. The technical breakthrough came from Rodriguez's background in industrial chemistry. She had worked on petroleum refining processes that used similar staged combustion principles to maintain controlled burns over extended distances. The challenge was adapting these industrial processes to portable military equipment that could function reliably under combat conditions. The modified flamethrowers, designated M1A1X in classified documents, featured 3 revolutionary improvements over standard equipment. First, a new fuel mixture that Rodriguez called extended burn napalm, a jellied gasoline compound that included metallic additives designed to maintain combustion through multiple ignition stages. Second, a completely redesigned nozzle system that created controlled fuel dispersion patterns optimized for maximum range rather than maximum area coverage. Third, a modified pressure system that used compressed air chambers to maintain consistent fuel pressure throughout the extended firing sequence. The most radical innovation was Rodriguez's cascade ignition system. Instead of a single ignition point at the nozzle, the modified flamethrowers featured multiple ignition elements positioned along the fuel stream itself. As the extended burn napalm traveled through the air, these elements would reignite the fuel mixture at predetermined intervals, maintaining combustion over distances that conventional physics suggested should be impossible. Testing at Majuro had produced results that amazed even Rodriguez herself. The modified flamethrowers could maintain effective flame streams at distances approaching 175 feet, nearly 5 times the range of standard equipment. More importantly, the extended burn napalm maintained sufficient heat and adhesion properties at these extended ranges to be tactically useful against fortified positions. The psychological impact of the extended range flames was even more significant than their physical destructive power. Test observers reported that the sight of flame streams reaching far beyond normal expectations created an almost supernatural impression, as if the weapons had somehow transcended natural limitations through technological alchemy. But the most remarkable aspect of Rodriguez's modifications were their elegance. Despite the revolutionary improvements in range and effectiveness, the modified flamethrowers weighed only 15 pounds more than standard equipment and could be operated by any Marine trained on conventional flame weapons. The complexity of the engineering was hidden beneath a deceptively simple exterior that betrayed no hint of the technological breakthrough contained within. On the evening of April 18th, Rodriguez personally supervised the loading of 12 modified flamethrowers onto the transport vessel USS Antares for immediate deployment to Kanaloa. The weapons had undergone only minimal field testing, and their first combat use would be against the defensive positions that had proven immune to conventional American tactics. The deployment was conducted under conditions of absolute secrecy. Even the Marine officers who would operate the weapons weren't briefed on their extended capabilities until immediately before their first combat mission. The official designation remained M1A1, and the external appearance of the modified weapons was virtually identical to standard equipment. Marine Sergeant Maria Santos was among the 12 specialists selected to operate the experimental weapons. Santos, a veteran flamethrower operator with combat experience from Guadalcanal and Bougainville, had volunteered for the Kanaloa mission after her previous unit had been decimated attempting conventional assaults on Japanese positions. She had no idea that the equipment she was about to carry into battle represented the most advanced flame weapon technology ever developed. The briefing that Santos and her team received was deliberately vague. They were told only that their equipment had been improved for extended effectiveness, and that they should attempt to engage enemy positions from maximum practical range. The true capabilities of the modified weapons were kept secret even from their operators, partly for security reasons and partly because military commanders weren't entirely convinced that the modifications would function reliably under combat conditions. British. What the American command structure didn't fully understand was that Rodriguez's modifications represented more than simple improvements to existing technology. They represented a fundamental breakthrough in flame warfare that would render every defensive calculation based on conventional weapon limitations completely obsolete. The psychological preparation for the mission was as important as the technical preparation. Santos and her team had studied detailed maps of Japanese defensive positions, focusing particularly on the mathematically precise 150-foot distances that had proven so effective at keeping American forces out of flamethrower range. Their mission was to approach these positions using conventional tactics, then test the effectiveness of their modified equipment against targets that had previously been considered unreachable. As dawn approached on April 19th, Lieutenant Matsumoto was conducting his routine morning observation from Position 7 when he spotted American forces beginning what appeared to be another conventional assault on the ridgeline. From his reinforced bunker, he could see the familiar pattern: infantry squads advancing in standard formation with the distinctive silhouettes of flamethrower operators clearly visible among the assault troops. Matsumoto felt the confidence that had sustained him through 6 days of successful defensive operations. The Americans were following exactly the same tactical approach that had failed repeatedly since the invasion began. They would advance across the open coral slopes, reach the 50-foot distance where Japanese defensive fire became overwhelming, and be forced to retreat after suffering heavy casualties. The mathematics of the situation remained unchanged. But as Matsumoto watched through his observation scope, something seemed different about this assault. The American flamethrower teams weren't advancing as aggressively as usual. Instead of attempting to close distance rapidly, they were taking careful positions at what appeared to be maximum range, approximately 150 feet from the Japanese defensive line. From her position among the coral outcroppings below Position 7, Sergeant Santos could see the Japanese bunker clearly. The reinforced concrete structure looked exactly as described in intelligence briefings: heavily fortified, optimally positioned, and completely beyond the reach of conventional flame weapons. But Santos wasn't carrying conventional flame weapons. At exactly 0645 hours, Santos squeezed the trigger of her modified M1A1X flamethrower. What happened next defied every assumption that both sides had made about flame warfare. Instead of the short-range burst that Matsumoto expected to see, a stream of liquid fire erupted from Santos's weapon and reached across the 150-foot distance like a blazing spear thrown by an angry god. The extended burn napalm maintained perfect combustion throughout its flight, striking the concrete face of Position 7 with explosive force and flowing into every crack and crevice of the fortification. From his position inside the bunker, Matsumoto's first reaction was complete disbelief. The flame stream reaching his position was impossible according to every calculation his engineers had made. American flamethrowers simply could not function at such distances. The physics wouldn't allow it. Yet liquid fire was flowing through the firing slits of his bunker, and the temperature inside the fortification was rising rapidly. The extended burn napalm displayed characteristics that seemed to violate natural law. Instead of burning out after reaching its maximum range like conventional napalm, the modified fuel mixture continued combusting with undiminished intensity. Worse, the metallic additives in Rodriguez's formula created a flame that burned significantly hotter than standard napalm, generating temperatures that could melt steel and consume oxygen from enclosed spaces with devastating efficiency. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of the attack was its precision. Santos wasn't simply spraying fire in the general direction of the Japanese position, she was directing controlled flame streams through specific openings in the fortification with surgical accuracy. The extended range of the modified weapon allowed for the kind of precise targeting that had been impossible with conventional flame equipment. Within 30 seconds of the initial flame burst, Position 7 was completely untenable. The interior temperature had risen to levels that made human occupation impossible, while toxic gases generated by the burning napalm created atmospheric conditions that prevented breathing.
Matsumoto and his surviving men were forced to evacuate through emergency exits, abandoning a position that they had believed was mathematically invulnerable. The evacuation of Position 7 sent shockwaves through the entire Japanese defensive network on Kanaloa. For 6 days, the mathematical certainty of their defensive positions had provided psychological as well as physical protection. The knowledge that American weapons couldn't reach them had allowed Japanese defenders to maintain morale despite overwhelming enemy superiority in numbers and equipment. The destruction of Position 7 shattered that psychological foundation. If American flamethrowers could reach targets at 150 feet, then every defensive calculation that Japanese engineers had made was worthless. Worse, if the Americans possessed weapons that could function at such impossible ranges, what other technological surprises might they be concealing?
Word of the impossible flame attack spread through Japanese communication networks within hours. Defenders at other positions reported seeing the attack from a distance, and their descriptions seemed to confirm the impossible. American forces had developed flame weapons that could reach distances no one had thought possible. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was immediate and devastating. Soldiers who had felt completely secure in their mathematically protected positions now faced the terrifying realization that they were vulnerable to weapons that defied their understanding of physical reality. The confident certainty that had sustained them through nearly a week of defensive operations evaporated in the face of technology that seemed almost supernatural in its capabilities. Lieutenant Matsumoto, evacuated from his destroyed position and temporarily stationed at a reserve bunker, struggled to comprehend what he had witnessed. His engineering training told him that what he had seen was impossible, yet the evidence of his senses was undeniable. American forces possessed flame weapons that could function at ranges that violated basic physics as he understood it. More disturbing was the implication that American technological capabilities extended far beyond what Japanese intelligence had estimated. If American engineers could extend flamethrower ranges by 500%, what other impossible improvements might they have achieved? The mathematical certainty that had formed the foundation of Japanese defensive planning was crumbling in the face of American innovation that refused to accept physical limitations. The tactical revolution. Over the following 6 hours, Santos and her team of modified flamethrower operators systematically destroyed every major Japanese defensive position on the ridgeline overlooking Sunset Beach. The extended-range capability of their weapons allowed them to engage fortifications that had been considered completely immune to flame attack, while maintaining safe distances that kept them beyond the effective range of Japanese defensive fire. The tactical implications of the extended-range flames were revolutionary. For the first time in Pacific warfare, American forces could use their most effective anti-fortification weapons against positions that couldn't return effective fire. The 150-foot range that had protected Japanese defenders now worked in favor of American forces equipped with weapons that could reach much farther than conventional defensive calculations had anticipated. Each successful attack reinforced the psychological impact on Japanese defenders. Position after position fell to flame weapons that seemed to violate natural law, creating a cascade of defensive collapses that spread far beyond the immediate target areas. Japanese soldiers began abandoning positions that hadn't even been attacked, unwilling to remain in fortifications that might be vulnerable to impossible American weapons. The mathematical precision that had characterized Japanese defensive planning became a liability when faced with American technology that operated beyond calculated parameters. The careful positioning that had kept Japanese forces exactly 150 feet from American approach routes now placed them at optimal range for weapons that could function effectively at 175 feet or more. American infantry commanders quickly recognized the tactical revolution that the extended-range flamethrowers represented. Instead of costly frontal assaults against fortified positions, they could now use flame weapons to clear defensive strongpoints from safe distances, then advance through areas that had been swept clean of organized resistance.
The speed of the tactical transformation was remarkable. Within 12 hours of the first successful extended-range flame attack, American forces had broken through defensive lines that had held for nearly a week. The mathematical fortress of Kanaloa was collapsing not through overwhelming force, but through technological innovation that had rendered its fundamental defensive assumptions obsolete. The final breakthrough. By evening on April 19th, the Japanese defensive network on Kanaloa had suffered complete systematic collapse. The extended-range flamethrowers had eliminated 17 major defensive positions without suffering a single operator casualty, demonstrating the decisive tactical advantage that technological superiority could provide over numerical or positional advantages. The final assault on the Japanese command bunker demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Rodriguez's modifications under optimal conditions. The command position, located on the highest point of the island and protected by multiple layers of defensive fortifications, had been designed to be absolutely impregnable to conventional assault. Its position 200 feet above the nearest American approach route should have placed it safely beyond the reach of any portable weapon. Sergeant Santos approached the command bunker using tactics that would have been impossible with conventional equipment. Instead of attempting to close distance under fire, she positioned herself at maximum effective range and began systematic destruction of the fortification using precisely directed flame streams. The extended burn napalm flowed through defensive positions like liquid death, reaching areas that conventional weapons could never have touched.
The rapid collapse of Japanese resistance on Kanaloa came at a psychological price that extended far beyond immediate military casualties. Lieutenant Matsumoto, evacuated from his destroyed position and captured during the final American assault, provided intelligence officers with detailed accounts of the psychological impact that extended-range flame weapons had on Japanese defenders. "We had calculated everything perfectly," Matsumoto told his American interrogators through a translator. "Every distance, every angle, every possible approach route. Our mathematics should have made us invulnerable. But your weapons, they reached distances that should have been impossible. It was like fighting against devils who could change the laws of physics." The psychological profiles of captured Japanese defenders revealed the profound impact that encountering impossible technology had on soldiers trained to believe that careful planning and mathematical precision could overcome any enemy advantage. Many reported that the extended-range flames had shattered their confidence not just in their defensive positions, but in their fundamental understanding of how warfare functioned. For American flamethrower operators like Sergeant Santos, the psychological impact was equally significant, but entirely different. The knowledge that they possessed weapons that could function beyond enemy expectations provided enormous confidence advantages, but also created moral complexities around the use of technology that seemed almost supernatural in its effectiveness. "It felt wrong somehow," Santos reported in post-battle interviews, "like we were cheating. These Japanese soldiers had done everything right. Their defensive positions were perfect for conventional weapons, but our equipment could reach them anyway. It wasn't really fair." The technological revolution. The success of Rodriguez's extended-range flamethrower modifications marked a turning point in military engineering philosophy that extended far beyond flame warfare. The demonstration that careful application of industrial technology could solve seemingly impossible military problems inspired a generation of military engineers to approach tactical challenges with unprecedented creativity. The classified development program that had produced the extended-range flamethrowers became the model for future military research projects throughout World War II and beyond. The combination of academic expertise, industrial innovation, and urgent military necessity created technological breakthroughs that repeatedly surprised enemy forces who based their planning on conventional weapon limitations. More importantly, the Kanaloa battle demonstrated that technological superiority could provide decisive advantages that transcended traditional military factors like numbers, training, or strategic position. The side with better technology could rewrite the rules of engagement in ways that rendered enemy preparations completely obsolete. This technological philosophy would influence American military development through Korea, Vietnam, and into the modern era, establishing the principle that innovative engineering could provide solutions to tactical problems that seemed impossible using conventional approaches. The battle for Kanaloa Island ended on April 20, 1944, less than 24 hours after the first deployment of extended-range flamethrowers. What had been predicted to be weeks-long siege requiring enormous casualties was resolved in a single day through the application of technology that redefined the possible. The strategic implications extended throughout the Pacific theater. Japanese forces across the region were forced to abandon defensive strategies based on calculated weapon ranges, never knowing whether American forces might possess other technological surprises that could exceed intelligence estimates. The psychological advantage of technological uncertainty became as important as the actual technological capabilities themselves. For the engineers and scientists who had developed the extended-range flamethrowers, Kanaloa represented validation of the principle that innovative thinking could overcome any obstacle. Captain Rodriguez was promoted to major and assigned to lead advanced weapons development projects that would influence military technology for decades. The mathematical fortress that had seemed impregnable through careful calculation and precise positioning was conquered by American engineers who refused to accept that physical limitations couldn't be transcended through creative application of scientific principles. The flame that had reached impossible distances hadn't just broken Japanese defensive lines, it had demonstrated that in modern warfare, the side with superior technological imagination would possess decisive advantages over opponents who relied on conventional understanding of what was possible. The coral beaches of Kanaloa had witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare, where the boundaries of the possible could be rewritten by engineers who approached military problems with the same innovative spirit that had built modern industrial civilization. The age of technological warfare had truly begun, and the world would never fight the same way again. The dragon's breath that had reached beyond impossible distances became the foundation for every advanced military system that followed, proving that American ingenuity could transform even the most desperate tactical situations into decisive victories.